Everyone knew the rule. If a hit squad made it inside your house, you were already dead. Not wounded, not threatened, dead. That rule had ended more careers than bullets ever did. Because the moment strangers crossed your threshold with intent, control was gone. Fear took over, panic followed, and the ending was always the same. Which is why what Lucky Luciano did that night made no sense to anyone who heard about it later. He didn't run, he didn't barricade himself, he didn't call in reinforcements. He opened the door. Not by mistake, not under pressure, not because he didn't know who was coming. Lucky knew exactly who they were. He knew why they were there, and he knew what they were supposed to do once they stepped inside. This wasn't a random crew. It wasn't a desperate move by amateurs. These were professionals. Men sent with one instruction and one outcome in mind. They weren't there to negotiate. They weren't there to send a warning. They were there to end something that had grown too powerful, too stable, too permanent. Lucky Luciano. From the outside, it looked like surrender. The kind of quiet resignation that comes when even the smartest man in the room realizes the board has turned against him. But inside that house, something else was happening. No shots were fired, no one screamed, no bodies were dragged out. And when the men finally left, they walked out alive, but not intact, not respected, not trusted, not employable. From that night on, those men were never the same again. And more importantly, no one ever sent another hit squad into Lucky Luciano's home. Because whatever happened behind that door was worse than death, and far more instructive. This is the story of why Lucky Luciano didn't stop the assassins at the door. He let them in, and by the time they walked out, the message had already spread through the underworld. Killing Lucky Luciano wasn't the dangerous part. Surviving him was. By the time the order went out, Lucky Luciano wasn't just a man anymore. He was a blockage. Every major operation flowed around him. Disputes stalled until his opinion was known. Alliances held or collapsed based on whether he approved. Even rivals who hated him privately still depended on the structure he had built. That kind of power doesn't invite negotiation forever. It invites removal. And removal had been discussed quietly for months. This wasn't about revenge. Nobody was avenging a dead brother or a broken deal. Those motives were emotional, sloppy, and loud. This was colder, strategic. Lucky wasn't being targeted because of what he'd done recently, but because of what he continued to prevent. Expansion, rebalancing, a reshuffling of power. Too many men wanted rooms opened that Lucky kept closed. Too many deals died because he said, "Not yet." Too many ambitions ended in silence because his word carried more weight than gunfire. So the idea began to circulate, not as a command, but as a consensus. Lucky had to go, not publicly, not dramatically, not in a way that triggered retaliation or chaos. He needed to disappear in a manner that felt inevitable, almost procedural. One house, one night, no witnesses, no noise. That's why a hit squad was chosen instead of a lone shooter. A single gunman could fail. Panic, mistalk. A squad meant certainty. Each man had a role. One to distract, one to watch exits, one to deliver the final act. They weren't hotheads. They weren't new. These were men who had ended lives quietly and returned to dinner an hour later. They were selected specifically because they had no personal history with Lucky, no grudges, no debts, no emotions to cloud judgment. To them, this was a job, and Lucky Luciano was just a name attached to a location. What none of them questioned was how easily the opportunity presented itself. No sudden disappearance, no change in routine, no visible increase in protection. Lucky stayed where he was, lived where he lived, met who he met. To the men planning the hit, this looked like complacency, like age, like a man who had survived so many attempts that he had begun to believe in his own myth. They mistook stability for weakness, and that was the final justification they needed. The order went out quietly, no celebrations, no speeches, just instructions, timing, and a door that would open. What they didn't understand, what no one understood yet, was that Lucky hadn't been unaware of the pressure building around him. He had simply decided not to resist it the way everyone expected. Because stopping the hit wasn't the goal. Ending the idea of sending one was. From the outside, it looked like a mistake. Any other man in Lucky's position would have reacted the moment the warning signs appeared. Extra guards, changed locations, vanishing for a few weeks until the temperature dropped. That was the standard playbook, and it worked most of the time. Lucky ignored it, not because he underestimated the threat, but because he understood something most men didn't. Defensive moves create confirmation. The moment you run, hide, or harden your perimeter, you tell your enemies they're right to move faster. And Lucky didn't want them faster. He wanted them inside. The house mattered, not because it was safe, but because it was controlled. Every sound, every hallway, every pause in conversation belonged to him. Once someone crossed that threshold, the balance shifted. The danger wasn't gone, but it was contained. That's why he didn't call in an army. More men meant more noise. More noise meant unpredictability. And unpredictability is the enemy of manipulation. Instead, Lucky stripped the situation down to its cleanest form. A small number of attackers, operating under the belief that they had surprise on their side. He knew who they were before they arrived, not names, profiles. Professionals don't travel invisibly. They leave ripples. Meetings change. Schedules tighten. Certain intermediaries stop answering calls. Lucky read those changes the same way other men read headlines. So when the knock finally came, it wasn't a shock. It was confirmation. He opened the door because refusing entry would force confrontation on their terms. Guns drawn, tension spiking. Outcomes decided in seconds. That kind of chaos favors the attackers. Letting them in did the opposite. Inside, time slowed. No immediate violence meant confusion. Confusion meant hesitation. And hesitation, in a hit squad, is lethal. Not physically, but psychologically. These men were trained for speed, not uncertainty. They expected resistance or panic, not hospitality. Lucky didn't greet them like enemies. He greeted them like guests. That alone unsettled the entire dynamic. You can't rush a man who isn't reacting. You can't intimidate someone who doesn't acknowledge the threat. And you can't execute a plan that depends on momentum when the target refuses to provide it. The house became a pressure chamber. Every minute that passed without action increased the cost of pulling the trigger. Every unanswered question. Why isn't he afraid? Why is he talking? Why aren't we moving? Chipped away at the certainty they needed to finish the job. Lucky understood this instinctively. He wasn't betting on mercy. He wasn't counting on negotiation. He was exploiting the one weakness even professionals carry with them. They need the situation to make sense. And inside that house, nothing did. By the time they realized the door closing behind them had changed the rules, it was already too late to reset the plan. Because the safest place for Lucky that night wasn't outside with guards and guns. It was right where his enemies thought he was most vulnerable. The first thing that broke wasn't the plan. It was the silence. A real hit moves fast. Orders are short. Words are minimal. Everyone knows their position, their timing, their exit. What filled Lucky's house that night wasn't urgency. It was waiting. Too much of it. The men spread out, just enough to feel in control. One near the door, one watching the hallway, one close enough to Lucky to act first when the signal came. They were professionals, but professionals still rely on rhythm, and the rhythm never arrived. Lucky talked, not nervously, not loudly, casually, about nothing that mattered and everything that distracted. Small comments, questions that didn't demand answers, remarks that forced eye contact when they wanted to avoid it. That was the trap, because attention is a resource, and once it's divided, coordination dies. One man kept glancing at the door. Another shifted his weight too often. The third started watching Lucky's hands instead of his partner's eyes. No one gave the signal. They were waiting for the right second. But the right second only exists when everyone agrees it does. Inside that room, agreement was dissolving. Lucky noticed it immediately. He didn't press. He didn't challenge. He let the uncertainty expand on its own. The longer it stretched, the heavier it became. Every second without action made the next one harder. Muscles tighten. Breathing changes. Thoughts get louder. Why hasn't he panicked? Why hasn't he tried to run? Why does it feel like we're late? That last thought is deadly. Because once a hit squad feels late, they feel exposed. And exposed men start improvising. One of them spoke first. It wasn't part of the plan. A question, poorly chosen, unnecessary, meant only to reassert control. But questions invite answers, and answers slow things down. Lucky responded calmly, deliberately, as if there were no weapons in the room at all. That response shattered the illusion of dominance. Now there were voices, now there were reactions, now there was something to lose. The man closest to the door shifted again. Too far this time. A mistake small enough to seem meaningless, but big enough for Lucky to clock it. The spacing was wrong now. Lines of fire overlapped. Exit paths narrowed. The room wasn't dangerous anymore. It was unstable. That's when Lucky stood up. Not suddenly. Not aggressively. Slowly. The way a man moves when he knows he's being watched and wants everyone to keep watching him. Standing forced them to reset their angles. Resetting angles forced them to look at each other. That's when it was over. Not because shots were fired. Not because someone lunged. But because the unspoken agreement, we are in control, collapsed. Each man realized, almost simultaneously, that if something went wrong, it wouldn't be clean. And in their world, messy meant blame. Blame meant retaliation. Retaliation meant consequences far beyond this room. They hadn't killed Lucky Luciano. They'd walked into his timing, and once that happened, the hit wasn't just failing. It was already finished. What happened next confused people for years. No gunfire, no bodies carried out, no police reports splashed across the papers. The men left, alive. And that detail is exactly why the story mattered. Lucky didn't need to kill them, because killing them would have been ordinary. Violence was expected. Retaliation was predictable. Another chapter in an endless cycle that solved nothing long-term. Letting them walk out changed the math. By the time they reached the door, they already understood something had gone wrong, but not in a way they could explain. No threats had been made, no orders issued, no clear line crossed. And yet every instinct they had told them the same thing. This job was over. Lucky didn't escort them, didn't warn them, didn't watch them leave. He sat back down. That mattered more than anything he could have said. Because the most unsettling message in their world wasn't aggression. It was indifference. Men who yell are emotional. Men who threaten are invested. A man who lets you go without comment is already thinking several moves ahead of where you stand. They walked out with their lives. But they didn't leave intact. On the street outside, no one spoke. They separated sooner than planned. That wasn't strategy. It was instinct. Each man wanted distance from the others. Distance from the decision that had nearly been made. Distance from the room where everything stopped making sense. By morning, the story had already started spreading. Not details, not names, just a shape. A hit squad entered Lucky's house. They came out different. That kind of story travels faster than facts, because it triggers fear without explanation. Other crews didn't ask what happened. They asked why nothing happened. And that question is poison in an underworld built on reputation. If professionals hesitate, if plans stall, if men leave without finishing the job, it means the target controls something invisible. Control is contagious. So are doubts. Within days, handlers stopped returning calls. Intermediaries softened their tone. The urgency drained out of conversations that had once been sharp. Nobody officially called off the contract. They just stopped pushing it forward. That's how power actually works, not by issuing commands, but by making everyone else unwilling to act. The men who entered Lucky's house were never punished publicly. No bodies turned up, no warnings carved into stone. And that silence became the loudest warning of all, because anyone watching understood the implication. If Lucky had wanted them dead, they wouldn't have made it to the door. And if he didn't need to kill them, then killing him was never going to be simple, no matter how many families wanted it done. From that night on, something shifted. People stopped talking about when Lucky would be taken out. They started asking how close was too close. That question has no good answer. And once it enters a system built on fear, the system begins to slow, hesitate, and fracture, all on its own. Lucky didn't survive that night because he was lucky. He survived because he understood a deeper rule. In a world obsessed with killing, the man who decides when not to becomes the most dangerous one in the room. After that night, nobody announced anything. There was no meeting, no declaration, no decision passed down from the top. And yet everyone understood the same thing. Lucky Luciano was no longer a target you rushed. Before, plans against him had been aggressive, direct, built on speed and overwhelming force. Afterward, those plans didn't disappear. They rotted. They sat unfinished, half-discussed, always postponed. Because once a man proves he can neutralize danger without touching a weapon, every calculation around him becomes unstable. People began re-examining old assumptions. If a hit squad could walk into his house and walk out alive, shaken, scattered, unwilling to explain what went wrong, then what else had they been wrong about? Was Lucky really vulnerable? Or had he always been untouchable in ways they didn't know how to measure? That uncertainty mattered more than fear. Fear can be pushed through, uncertainty can't. Some families quietly pulled back. Others pretended nothing had changed while subtly redirecting attention elsewhere. New enemies emerged. New conflicts replaced the old one. Lucky didn't need to deflect pressure. The pressure found other targets on its own, and Lucky never corrected the rumors. He didn't clarify, didn't deny, didn't embellish. He let the story stay incomplete. Because incomplete stories are the most powerful kind. They force people to fill the gaps themselves, and the gaps always grow larger than reality. One version said the men froze. Another said Lucky named each of them without being told. Another said he'd already buried replacements for them. None of it mattered. What mattered was that nobody could prove otherwise, and in the underworld, proof is everything. From then on, people spoke differently around him. Conversations slowed. Offers were framed more carefully. Threats vanished entirely. When Lucky entered a room, men didn't stiffen. They recalculated. That's the moment a man stops being hunted and starts being accounted for. The hit squad became a cautionary reference, never described directly, just implied. Remember what happened last time. You know how that ended. We don't need another situation like that. No names, no details, just memory. Lucky never gained new territory from that night, never demanded tribute, never made an example. And that's exactly why it worked. Because the goal was never dominance, it was deterrence without escalation. Years later, when people asked how Lucky stayed alive while others fell, the answers always missed the point. They talked about alliances, money, politics, bribes, but the truth was simpler and far colder. Lucky didn't survive because he was stronger than his enemies. He survived because he understood them better than they understood themselves. He knew when violence would solve a problem. And more importantly, he knew when withholding it would solve the problem permanently. That night, a hit squad walked into his house expecting to end a life. Instead, they learned a rule they would carry forever. You don't attack a man who controls the moment, because the moment will turn on you before he ever has to. And after that lesson spread, no one was eager to learn it twice. Years later, people would still argue about what really happened that night. They'd debate how many men came in, who sent them, what Lucky said or didn't say. But no one ever questioned the result. A hit squad entered Lucky Luciano's house with a job to do, and none of them walked out the same men. Not because they were wounded, not because they were threatened, but because something they relied on, certainty, never made it back out with them. That door became a line in the underworld. Cross it and the rules changed. From that point on, Lucky was no longer measured by how many men he could put on the street or how fast he could pull a trigger. He was measured by something far more dangerous, how completely he controlled the situation even when he appeared exposed. That's why his enemies didn't rush him anymore. That's why plots against him slowed, then dissolved. And that's why men who hated him still learned to respect distance. Because once someone shows they can survive without reacting, without panicking, without escalating, you realize you're not facing a man playing the same game. You're facing someone who decides when the game even starts. Lucky didn't win that night by killing anyone. He won by proving that entering his world didn't guarantee an outcome. And uncertainty is the one thing professional killers cannot operate under for long. In the end, the story isn't about mercy. It's not about intimidation. It's about control. Control of space, control of time, control of narrative. And that's why Lucky Luciano outlived so many men who were stronger, louder, and more violent than he ever was. Because when power learns to sit quietly and wait, everyone else has to move first. And when they do, they're already behind. That's the lesson of the night Lucky let his enemies walk into his house. Not all traps look like traps. Some look like open doors.